You ever notice how there are moments, quiet ones, usually when you catch yourself in the middle of some familiar pattern and wonder, almost with a soft ache, why do I keep doing this? Maybe it happens while staring at your phone long after midnight, scrolling through the same recycled dopamine loops. Maybe in the silence after another argument where you said things you swore you'd never say again. Or maybe in that strange hollow feeling you get when you realize you've repeated something you promised yourself you were done with. And in these seconds, which feel both still and sharp, you sense a kind of paradox living inside you. The version of you who desperately wants to change, and the quieter, older self who clings to the comfort of the familiar, even when the familiar hurts. You feel like a person watching your own life through a window, whispering instructions to yourself that never quite land. And the strangest part is, you're not stupid, you're not weak, you're not lazy, you're aware, painfully aware. You see your habits, your impulses, your contradictions, with an almost uncomfortable clarity. And yet, something in you resists, as if part of your mind would rather keep you stuck than let you grow. And there's a question that lingers in the air, one you may be afraid to admit but feel constantly. If I can see my bad habits so clearly, why can't I change them? This is where our story begins, not with failure, but with a mystery that every human being encounters at least once, whether they speak it aloud or bury it somewhere deep, like a secret they're too ashamed to explore. Because the truth is, changing a habit is not just about willpower or discipline. It is about becoming conscious of the layers beneath the layer you think you understand. It is about realizing that most of your life is not lived by you, not the conscious you who dreams, reflects, and plans, but by a quieter you who operates on old scripts, inherited fears, and ancient instincts that don't ask for your permission. And before we talk about transformation, we have to talk about illusion. You wake up in the morning, check your phone before even breathing deeply, and tell yourself it's harmless. You scroll through messages, notifications, and the artificial dramas of people you barely know, and you think you assume that you're choosing all of this. You get dressed, go to work, interact with people in predictable patterns, laugh at moments you don't find funny, agree with things that don't sit right with you, and absorb small irritations like dust settling on a shelf. You drive the same route, buy the same food, think the same thoughts, almost as if someone pressed repeat on your life without you noticing. And yet, if someone asked you whether you're aware, whether you're paying attention, you'd say yes, of course you are. But awareness is not the same thing as consciousness. Awareness is noticing a thought pass by. Consciousness is questioning why it appeared. Awareness is feeling uncomfortable after repeating a bad habit. Consciousness is asking who inside you benefits from keeping it alive. And most of your habits, especially the ones you can't change, are not alive because they're powerful. They're alive because you're unconscious to the deeper emotional agreements that created them. Think about the last time you reached for a habit you swore you were done with. Maybe binge watching something to escape the dullness of the day. Maybe reaching for junk food after telling yourself you'd eat clean. Maybe texting someone you know is wrong for you. Maybe returning to a cycle of fear, procrastination, or comparison. In that moment, you didn't decide to do it. It just happened. Automatically. Effortlessly. Like a reflex your mind rehearsed thousands of times. And this is where the everyday illusion appears. You believe you are the one steering your life. But most days, you're simply being carried by a current you didn't notice you stepped into years ago. At the office, your coworkers laugh politely at a boss's joke. You join them without thinking, even though nothing in you found it remotely amusing. During a conversation with friends, someone asks how you're doing. You answer, good, just busy, even though you feel tired, lost, or quietly breaking. At a family gathering, you slip into the same role you've played since childhood, the quiet one, the fixer, the rebel, the achiever, the peacemaker, without ever questioning whether this version of you is still who you want to be. These small, almost invisible moments aren't trivial. They are the architecture of your habit-driven life. Because habits aren't just actions, they are identities, repeated until they become masks, masks repeated until they become prisons. And behind every habit you can't break lies a story you stopped examining long ago. You think you struggle with self-control, but really, you struggle with self-awareness. You think the problem is discipline, but the problem is unconsciousness. You think you lack motivation, but you actually lack understanding of the deeper emotional engine driving your decisions. And this is why habits are so hard to change. Not because you don't want to grow, but because your habits were built to protect you, soothe you, distract you, or shield you from something you didn't have the tools to handle at the time. They became your silent companions, your armor, your anesthesia. And now, even when they hurt you, part of you still trusts them. So before awakening comes understanding. Before transformation comes the slow unraveling of illusion. And now that the illusion has been gently revealed, we step into the next moment of your journey. The moment where awareness sharpens into something more dangerous, more liberating, and more alive. The moment we call awakening. You know, awakening rarely arrives like a loud revelation or a heroic breakthrough. More often, it slips in quietly, like a faint whisper in a familiar room, a tiny shift in perception that makes everything look slightly different, slightly brighter, slightly more unsettling. It's that moment when you observe yourself reacting to something, anger rising, disappointment blooming, fear tightening your chest, and instead of being consumed by the reaction, you suddenly watch it from a distance, as if some deeper intelligence within you finally opened its eyes. Maybe you're sitting alone in your room late at night, reflecting on a day that drained you more than it should have, and you feel a strange sensation, like a veil lifting. You realize that the arguments you had, the cravings you indulged, the distractions you chased, none of it was random. Every moment had a thread, and that thread led back to an emotion you never acknowledged. Maybe it was loneliness, maybe insecurity, maybe boredom, frustration, or that quiet fear that you're not enough. And in that brief instant of clarity, everything slows. You don't just notice your habits, you see them. You don't just feel your emotions, you understand them. And with that understanding comes a heaviness, a trembling awareness of how deeply your life has been shaped by patterns you didn't choose. But awakening is not comfortable. It is not clean. It is not peaceful. It is the moment you realize you've been living on autopilot, and that realization comes with a sting. Like sunlight hitting eyes accustomed to darkness, you feel exposed, not to others, but to yourself. You see how much of your life has been a reaction rather than a creation. You see how many of your habits have been survival mechanisms disguised as preferences. You see how much you've been avoiding, distracting, suppressing. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. This is the beginning of the internal rupture, the beginning of the shift that isolates you more than it frees you. Because once you awaken, even slightly, you begin to feel like an outsider in your own life. This is where isolation begins, not the physical kind, but the emotional silence that follows when you realize most people are still living the way you used to. Asleep, unaware, caught in loops they never question. You observe them laughing, arguing, gossiping, complaining, chasing things without knowing why, numbing themselves without understanding what hurts, performing roles they didn't choose, and you feel a strange distance between their world and yours. It's as if you've stepped behind the curtain of existence, and now you see the ropes and pulleys everyone else pretends aren't there. You see the insecurity behind someone's aggression, the longing behind someone's arrogance, the exhaustion behind someone's constant positivity. You see the worlds hidden inside people, worlds they don't even know they carry. And while this deeper perception may feel like a gift, at first it feels more like a burden. Because once you see the inner mechanics of human behavior, it becomes hard to participate in the dance with the same innocence. You become the observer in a room full of actors who don't know they're acting. You start to feel out of place, like you're listening to a conversation happening on two frequencies at once. The words people say, and the truth beneath their words. And that truth is often heavier, softer, more fragile than anyone admits. The more conscious you become, the more alone you feel. And to illustrate this, imagine someone, let's call him Aaron. Aaron was always perceptive, always sensitive to the atmosphere around him, even when he didn't fully understand why. But as he grew older and became more aware of his emotions, his patterns, and the patterns of the people around him, something shifted. During conversations with friends, he could sense the masks they wore, the humor hiding pain, the bravado hiding insecurity, the nonstop chatter hiding loneliness. At work, he could feel when someone disagreed but stayed silent, could see when someone was pretending to be confident but was secretly terrified of making a mistake. In his family, he could detect the wounds passed from generation to generation, the unspoken expectations, the unresolved tensions sitting quietly like shadows at the dinner table. And the more he noticed, the more distant he became, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. Awareness made him compassionate, but compassion made him tired. He felt like he was waking up in a world where everyone else was still sleepwalking. And perhaps the hardest part was this: he couldn't explain it to anyone. How do you articulate something that feels more like a shift in the soul than a thought in the mind? How do you tell someone that their anger isn't really about you, but about old wounds they never healed? How do you express to a friend that their relationship problems stem not from their partner, but from their fear of being alone? You can't, or at least Aaron couldn't. He tried once, gently, with someone he cared about. He tried to help them see a pattern they kept repeating, a habit that hurt them more than they realized. But instead of understanding, they became defensive, angry, distant. And in that moment, Aaron realized something that broke him a little. Most people don't want truth. They want comfort. They want familiarity. They want the illusion that everything is fine. Awareness had isolated him not because he was better or wiser, but because he saw too deeply in a world that values surfaces. And maybe you've felt that too, that quiet ache of being the one who notices, the one who sees, the one who feels the weight of things nobody else acknowledges. Noticing becomes exhausting. Seeing becomes overwhelming. Feeling becomes heavy. And so you withdraw, not out of pride, but out of protection. Because awakening makes you sensitive, and sensitivity in an unconscious world can feel like a curse. But this isolation is not the end of your journey. It is the midpoint, the valley you must walk through before you understand your role in the greater landscape of your life. Because in isolation, something profound begins. The confrontation between what you've awakened to and what the world still expects you to be. And from that confrontation will rise your next great challenge, the conflict. And now, we enter the space where your awakening collides with the world you once moved through effortlessly. The space where clarity becomes both a weapon and a wound. This is the conflict, the tension between the person you were and the person you're becoming, between the habits that once protected you and the truth that now exposes them. You find yourself standing in the middle of a quiet psychological battlefield, torn between speaking and staying silent, between helping and stepping back, between intervening and observing. Because once you see a pattern within yourself or within someone you care about, you feel an almost instinctual pull to fix it, to illuminate it, to guide someone out of the maze they don't know they're trapped in. But you also know that awareness forced upon someone becomes resistance, and truth delivered too soon becomes pain. So you hesitate. You feel the weight of every choice. Maybe you're talking to someone you love, someone repeating a cycle of self-doubt or unhealthy behavior, and your chest tightens because you see exactly where their actions are leading. You see how they're hurting themselves, how they're sabotaging their progress, how they're burying their own potential under layers of fear or insecurity. And a part of you wants to reach in, tear down the veil, and show them what you see with such clarity. But another part of you whispers, they're not ready. And so you swallow the truth. You let the moment pass. You sit with the discomfort of watching someone you care about walk into pain you know they could avoid. This is the quiet agony of awareness. You become responsible for things others don't even know exist. And then there's the conflict within yourself. The version of you who wants to change your own habits, the emotional eater, the procrastinator, the overthinker, the self-saboteur, begins to argue with the version of you that is awakened. You tell yourself, I know better now. I see the pattern. But the familiar pull of old behaviors calls you back, not because you're weak, but because your nervous system recognizes the past as safe, even when it's harmful. So you stand in this tension, knowing what must change, yet feeling the seduction of who you used to be. And this inner tug of war drains you in ways you never expected. But conflict is not your breaking point. It is the trembling doorway into collapse. The moment where your old self fights for survival while your new self struggles to emerge. Collapse doesn't arrive with drama or noise. It happens slowly, quietly, like a gradual sinking into emotional quicksand. It is the exhaustion that creeps in after too many days of carrying invisible truths, too many nights spent analyzing your own patterns, too many moments trying to hold the weight of everyone else's unspoken emotions. Your mind becomes loud even in silence. You start feeling drained by conversations that once felt easy. You feel heavy in rooms you used to move through lightly. You become overly sensitive to noise, to energy, to tension, to dishonesty. Everything starts to feel amplified. The tone in someone's voice, the shift in their posture, the subtext behind their words. You pick up on emotional signals you never asked to receive, like a radio tuned to every frequency at once, and this constant awareness becomes suffocating. You feel like your mind is absorbing too much, too many emotions, too many observations, too many layers beneath layers. It becomes overwhelming to simply be yourself. And when you finally try to sit alone with your thoughts, seeking peace, you find that even your inner world has become crowded. You start thinking about your thinking, analyzing your own emotions, dissecting your habits, judging your progress. You begin to feel like you're drowning in your own mind. Your desire to change your habits turns into an obsession with fixing everything at once. Your awakening begins to feel like a curse because it brings clarity without the strength to act on it. You try to push through, force transformation, demand progress from yourself, but this only deepens your fatigue. Eventually, something in you breaks, not loudly, not visibly, but quietly, like a soft internal collapse. You lose the energy to keep caring about every detail. You lose the drive to analyze every emotion. You lose the strength to carry everyone else's burdens. And in this collapse, an unexpected truth emerges. No one can operate at the level of awareness you've forced yourself into. No one can sustain constant introspection without becoming overwhelmed. No one can change their habits while fighting themselves every step of the way. Collapse, painful as it feels, is not failure. It is your mind's way of saying, you are doing too much. You are trying too hard. You are holding too much. It is the body's gentle insistence that healing requires softness, not force, space, not pressure, release, not control. And so, as you sink into this emotional exhaustion, something subtle begins to shift beneath the surface. A quiet wisdom starts forming, like the first faint glow of dawn behind a horizon you once thought was the end. The collapse is not your conclusion, it is the threshold to your revelation. It is the moment before rebirth, the inhale before the exhale, the stillness before the rise. And from the quiet rubble of your collapse, something begins to rise, not dramatically, not triumphantly, but softly, like the way morning light slips into a room without asking permission. This is the revelation, not the loud kind found in movies or the sudden enlightenment people fantasize about, but the gentle, living truth that comes when the mind has finally exhausted itself enough to stop fighting. It begins with a realization so simple you almost miss it. You don't need to fix everything. You don't need to carry everyone's emotions. You don't need to understand every pattern, decode every habit, or interpret every subtle shift in the people around you. Awareness is a gift, but it is also something that must be handled with grace. And grace begins with letting yourself be human. You sit in the quiet aftermath of burnout and realize that much of your suffering didn't come from seeing too much, but from believing you were responsible for everything you saw. You carried the weight of others' unspoken wounds, Believing your insight meant it was your duty to heal them. You carried the pressure of perfection. Believing your awakening meant you should no longer make mistakes. But revelation arrives when you understand that awareness was meant to free you, not imprison you, meant to soften you, not harden you, meant to guide you, not drown you. You begin noticing something profound. Not every emotion needs analysis. Not every habit needs eradication. Not every thought needs confrontation. Some things, many things, need only to be witnessed. And in that witnessing, without force, they begin to soften on their own. You realize you don't need to destroy your bad habits. You need to understand what they were protecting. Maybe your overeating wasn't gluttony, but self-soothing from years of emotional neglect. Maybe your procrastination wasn't laziness, but fear of disappointing people whose approval became your oxygen. Maybe your addiction to distraction wasn't mindlessness, but an attempt to avoid the silence that once scared you. When you see your habits not as enemies, but as younger parts of yourself longing for safety, compassion becomes your new form of discipline. Understanding becomes your new version of strength. Boundaries become your new shape of love. And with revelation comes a new kind of freedom. The freedom to choose which thoughts deserve your attention, which emotions deserve your energy, and which habits deserve your care. You understand now that growth is not a linear battle but a cyclical unfolding, an ebb and flow of progress and relapse, clarity and confusion, strength and softness. You begin to practice something unusual, stepping back. You stop trying to control everything you notice. You stop trying to fix everyone you understand. You stop trying to force transformation through tension. Instead, you move with your awareness rather than against it. You speak truth when invited, not when compelled. You intervene when safe, not when desperate. You listen to your instincts without letting them pull you into exhaustion. You rest. You breathe. You allow life to be imperfect. You allow yourself to be imperfect, and something beautiful begins to happen. The habits that once clung to you lose their grip, not because you fought them, but because you stopped feeding them with fear. You begin choosing differently, not perfectly, not always, but more often than before. You begin to feel proud of small victories rather than ashamed of small failures. You begin to feel lighter, not because life changed, but because your relationship with yourself did. And from here we move into the final movement of your journey, integration, the place where wisdom settles into your bones and begins shaping your life quietly, naturally, consistently. Integration is the moment your awakening no longer feels like an earthquake, but a rhythm, steady, calm, guiding you through your days. It is the realization that awareness doesn't need to isolate you. It can actually connect you more deeply. You start meeting people where they are, not where you expect them to be. You start loving without trying to fix. You start listening without trying to decode. You start observing without carrying the world on your shoulders. And you return to yourself, not the fearful, confused version who questioned why change felt impossible, but the softer, wiser version who understands now that change flows when you stop gripping it with desperation. You realize that every habit you struggled with was not a flaw in your character, but a message, a signal, a doorway back to something you needed to learn about yourself. You see that your collapse was not a failure, but a clearing. Your conflict was not a mistake, but a catalyst. Your isolation was not a punishment, but an invitation. An invitation to return to the most essential truth. You are not here to be perfect. You are here to grow, to soften, to fall and rise, to evolve in cycles, to awaken again and again. And now, at the end of this journey, you return to the paradox, where we began the question of why you could see your habits so clearly but couldn't change them. And now you understand. Clarity without compassion becomes pressure. Awareness without boundaries becomes exhaustion. Insight without rest becomes collapse. Change requires neither force nor fear. It requires understanding, patience, and a willingness to meet yourself with softness. And so you stand here, in this final moment of integration, knowing that you don't need to rush, you don't need to fight, you don't need to demand transformation from yourself. You simply need to stay conscious, Stay curious. Stay gentle. Your habits will shift when you do. Not instantly, not magically, but steadily, naturally, beautifully. And when they do, you'll finally see the truth. You never struggled to change because you were weak. You struggled because you were evolving. And evolution, unlike force, happens slowly, quietly, and with love.